All right, guys, welcome. Hope everybody had a good spring break and got a chance to decompress a little bit. We have a lot to get through today. We have to get through the causes of the Great Depression that we didn't get to cover 2 weeks ago, and then all of the New Deal and all of the 1930s, basically. So we're going to jump right in. Hopefully, at the end of class, we'll have enough time to talk about your midterm review. Keep in mind your midterm is coming up next week. Your reviews are posted under the exam reviews tab on the left of your Blackboard shell. Basically a list of terms that correlate to all of your multiple choice questions for the midterm. So hopefully everybody's doing well in their midterm reviews. Also keep in mind there's 25 points extra credit available if you complete your midterm reviews and email them either to myself or your respective TAs. Okay. Any questions for me? General questions before I jump into content?
None from me. Thank you, Professor.
All right, great. Cool. Well, let's jump right in then. All right, so we ended 2 weeks ago talking about economic policies of Republicans in the 1920s under the Harding and Coolidge administrations, the impact of the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who believes in these laissez-faire economic policies, talked about the sort of general economic platform of 1920s Republicans, which favored big businesses and what we would now call trickle-down economics or supply-side economics, which supported the rich, supported corporations, and we start to see this widening of these income disparities between the rich and the poor, the decimation of the middle class. But at the same time, it's this period of economic boom, interest in the stock market, isolationism. We talked about the impact of these political isolationists coming out of World War I, how they influenced the Republican Party. And we got right up to the Hoover administration. So we'll start there today. The election of 1928, where Republicans run Herbert Hoover and Democrats run a man named Alfred Smith. Hoover is actually has an interesting backstory. He was actually orphaned as a young child, was raised by his uncle in Oregon. Later in his life, he accumulated substantial wealth through the mining industry, extracting precious metals from different mines around the world. He was an engineer. He was one of the first graduating classes, or part of the first graduating class of Stanford. And so his backstory in many ways sort of supports his belief in these Republican notions of individualism, right? That the government shouldn't be involved in promoting for the financial well-being of citizens, that American individuals are responsible for their own economic well-being, and very much supports this Republican economic platforms of the 1920s. He also employs Andrew Mellon, who is really the architect of this laissez-faire economic system, this trickle-down economic system. So he will very much continue the economic policies of Republicans. It's an interesting election because Hoover really wins in a landslide. I believe he wins 40 states and really dominates the election. And one main reason for this is because Alfred Smith is a Catholic. So this really speaks to this nativist movement that we talked about in the 1920s, which was very much designed as an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish movement that sought to redefine American identity as, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So he was doomed in the election because he was a Catholic. We've only ever had one non-Catholic president, JFK. I'm sorry, one non-Protestant president, JFK, who was a Catholic, although that's a bit complicated because Martin Van Buren wasn't really a problem. Well, we don't need to get into that. Anyway, Hoover continues these economic platforms and policies of the Republicans before him, supports laissez-faire economic policies, but he's the one who really experiences the downfall or the repercussions of these policies destabilizing the American economy. So he takes office in early 29. He wins the election of 28, takes office in early 29, and only 10 months into his presidency in October of 29, October 29th, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashes. This is due to many factors. We'll talk about those here in just a second. But one of the most important factors was lack of regulation in the stock market. We know that Americans are becoming more and more interested and more involved in the stock market as companies are giving benefits or stock packages as part of employment benefits. Many Americans are convinced that the American economy is untouchable, that this growth of the 1920s, unprecedented growth, will continue unfettered throughout the 1930s, and that it's really not a risk to invest your savings into the stock market. So these naive Americans investing in corporations is one factor that contributes to these corporations becoming bloated, or their valuations becoming unrealistic, right? These bloated stock valuations that say companies are worth far more than they actually are. So that's one of the many factors that contributes to this stock market crash in 29. $10 billion in market value was lost in 5 hours. Over 16 million stocks are traded in a single day. This is an incredible panic that begins a downward spiral of the American economy that will eventually affect the global economy. Since we talked about after World War I, US banks are much more involved in foreign investments, in rebuilding Europe after World War I, investing in German banks to help them pay reparations to France and England, and also becoming inextricably linked with French and English banking systems. So we're very much involved in a global economic system at this point. And when our economy crashes, the entire world's, or capitalist world's, economy crashes. Okay, so this marks the beginning of the Great Depression. So we need to talk about the 5 main factors that contributed to and brought about the Great Depression. The first we've already discussed, the stock market crash. Overestimating the value of corporations based on stock speculation and lack of federal regulation of the stock market, right? The government isn't involved in regulating the stock market to make sure that prices are fair and adjusted to consumers that are buying those stocks. So this lack of regulation is really what was promoted by the Republicans in the 1920s and reflects this laissez-faire economic process. All right, the second one we could talk about is a prolonged depression in the farming sector. Agriculture starts a depression prior to the national economy going through a depression. Low agricultural prices in the 1920s have really hurt American farmers. Also, this sort of reordering of farms to more reliance and dependence on commercial farms have hurt the prices of farm products, have hurt small farmers trying to compete on a national market. Again, there's no regulation. The federal government isn't involved in setting prices for farm products. So without that regulation, we see commercial farms exploiting the markets, and also small independent farmers being pushed out of the process. All right, the third we can talk about is the banking crisis. After the stock market crashes, Americans by and large really lose faith in the financial system. and the financial sector of America, and begin running to banks in what is known as bank runs and pulling all of their money out of banks because they don't trust banks, because they see them as a functionary of the market, right? They see these banks as being an extension of the open market, which has just crashed. And so they worry that the market has been destabilized, and they start pulling their money out and, hiding it under their mattresses. This will further destabilize the economy because banks are really a crucial part to a capitalist economy, and they can't function without the deposits of everyday Americans or businesses, right? Banks make money by taking the money that you put into the bank, lending it to other people, and charging them interest. So without enough money in the banks, banks start closing by the thousands. In 1629, I'm sorry, just taught 1301. In 1929, 650 banks close. The next year, in 1930, 1,300 banks close. So we start to see this snowball effect as more and more Americans lose faith in the financial sector or the banking industry. They pull their money out, which further destabilizes banks, which is sort of the foundation of a capitalist economy. Okay, so the stock market crash, the prolonged depression in the agricultural sector, and bank runs are the first three we've discussed. The fourth is sort of a general unequal distribution of wealth that has been carried out throughout the 1920s. Economists are going to realize, mainly because of the influence of a man named John Maynard Keynes, the importance of purchasing power for citizens in an economic system. Due to these 1920s policies, economic policies, the middle class is decimated. This becomes, conditions in the economy become very stratified, much like they were during the Gilded Age, right? Where there's a very small middle class, there's a very large labor class or working class that supports a very small managerial or ownership class that owns the majority of property and capital in the United States. So again, this unequal distribution of wealth doesn't give Americans enough purchasing power to uphold the economy. Okay, so they're not buying enough products because they're being stripped of their wages and their benefits as this wealth is distributed unequally between the managerial class and the working class. Does that make sense? Very much like the economic dynamics of the Gilded Age. And this leads to one of the main causes of the Depression, which we all learned about in middle school, this overproduction and underconsumption, right? During the 1920s, these companies believed that they can produce as many products as they want, and Americans will continue to buy these products. Another hindrance to people buying these products is the concept of isolationism, right? We want to sell our products foreignly, but we're restricting the companies that can sell their products in America. So foreign economic relations are really hurt by these isolationists closing potential markets to buy American products. What really happens in the 1920s is the economy stalls in 1926. Remember, we talked about how the economy was really fueled by the automotive industry. Well, by 1926, after we've gotten out of the post-war recession, Americans don't need to buy more than one car. They don't need to buy more than one, household product, whether they appliances or what have you. So sales really stall in 1926, but companies continue to produce the same amount of products or even increase their production of products, which floods the market with products, which then drives the price of those products down, right? Supply and demand. So this overproduction is fueled by this idea that America's economy will never stop growing. Rather than looking at sales after 1926 and realizing that they have stalled out, also looking at European markets that are no longer buying American products, they don't adjust their production. They just continue to flood the market with products, which devalues those products and contributes to the Depression. All right, so everybody understand the five main causes of the Depression? Overproduction and underconsumption, this general unequal distribution of wealth, the bank runs, the prolonged depression in the farming sector, and the stock market crash itself. All right. All right, so as I said, this takes place on an international scale where our international ties, financial ties to Great Britain and France and Germany, this sort of economic restructuring of Europe after World War I will cause a spiral where every capitalist nation in the world is affected by this economic crisis. So we look at Hoover and his response, right? He's our leader. He is the president. He's in charge of the executive branch. And so people look to him for his response at how he's going to deal with this depression. And his response is very much to reiterate the importance of individualism. He believes that the way the American economy is going to be fixed is by Americans picking themselves up by their bootstraps and working harder. He doesn't understand the intricacies of what actually caused this depression. And this really hurts his or the public's opinion of Hoover. Newspapers are starting to write about, these same muckrakers are starting to write about Hoover's neglect of the American people. We're going to see as unemployment starts to rise after 29. When Hoover takes office in 29, unemployment is a little over 3%. By the time he leaves office in 1932, unemployment is nearing a quarter of the population. 23% of Americans are unemployed. At the same time, Hoover believes it's important to portray himself as a man of power or a man of decadence because he sees himself as an extension of the reputation of America on a global scale. So when foreign entities look at the presidency or read about Hoover, he believes that he needs to present himself as nothing is wrong. This leads him to hold 5-course, lavish, decadent meals in the White House while there's literally people sleeping in tents on the lawn of the White House. He closes the drapes to them and turns around to a 5-course decadent meal. So this to Americans looks like Hoover is abandoning them. But Hoover believes that this is the best way to present America on a global scale, which is not very smart, right? Hoover really is reliant on Andrew Mellon and this idea that the economy will correct itself, that the market rules all, that the government should not impede on the market, and eventually the market is a self-correcting entity that the government doesn't need to be involved in. So he basically sits back and does nothing as thousands and eventually millions of Americans lose their job and start to, rely on limited local government assistance and bread lines and soup lines and et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's talk about Americans in the Depression. 23% unemployment by 1932. This really hurt urban areas the most. We talked about the Great Migration and this continued industrialization due to jobs providing services or providing products for World War I. Because of this, really since the Second Industrial Revolution, we've seen this urbanization of American society where people are moving to big urban cities like Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and so forth. So it really hits urban communities the hardest. Hundreds of thousands of evictions from these tenement houses and these basically, dormitories and apartments that are often owned by companies that house their employees. And so we see a reverse in this long-standing migration pattern that traditionally, since the Civil War, or really since the Second Industrial Revolution, has gone from farm to city or from rural areas to cities. Now we see a reversal in the 1930s where Americans are starting to seek land, go west, and try to create subsistence farms again, try to provide for their families and grow subsistence food rather than relying on factory jobs or manufacturing jobs. We see the highest suicide rate in American history in 1933. Also, the lowest birth rate in American history is in the 1930s. This leads to what is known as the silent generation, who grew up throughout the Great Depression. And people aren't having kids because it's expensive to have kids. All right. We also need to talk about a prolonged problem in the agriculture sector throughout the 1930s, which is commonly referred to as the Dust Bowl. So to make conditions even worse for agriculture in the 1930s, we go through a prolonged drought in the southern plains of the United States. So these southern plains are the Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas territories that are just north of the Deep South, right? South of the Midwest. So these southern plains have been reorganized beginning really in the late 19th century with the Dawes Act, as American farmers are flooding into these territories because the government stripped these territories of Native Americans. Remember, we talked about the Oklahoma land rushes and the Sooners jumping the gun. So these American farmers come in and they dig up millions of acres of grassland to plant crops. Well, the reason these are grasslands in the southern plains are because of the winds in these areas. The conditions, the climatic conditions led or needed grass to hold down the topsoil in these southern plains. So this is known as the Great Plow Up, where thousands of farmers plow up these grasslands, which were holding down the topsoil, plant crops, then a drought hits in the 1930s. There's not enough rain to hold down the topsoil. They've already stirred up the area, and dust storms come in, blowing away their crops and really ruining the territory for agricultural cultivation. So we go through this substantial drought throughout the 1930s, which really doesn't end until 38, 39. And this really hurts the agricultural industry, which has already been majorly affected by the dip in agricultural prices in the 1920s, which again are tied to foreign markets no longer buying American products and the commercialization of large farms. I know all of this is a little confusing. If you guys have questions, let me know. So this leads to what are known as black blizzards, where you have dust storms just take over entire cities, cause static electricity storms, which take out power grids in big cities in Oklahoma and Kansas and the Texas Panhandle. You have swarms of grasshoppers and locusts come through the area to eat nutrients out of the dust that's flying in the air. So these sort of biblical apocalyptic conditions where you have literal clouds of dust rolling through cities and swarms of grasshoppers invading cities, taking out power grids. You have people dying of dust inhalation and respiratory problems. Many of you have probably read The Grapes of Wrath, which is a very important book written by John Steinbeck about a family who's basically forced out of Oklahoma because of the Dust Bowl, and they moved to California seeking agricultural work. So this comes at a terrible time during the economic depression, which will only prolong and further negatively impact the agricultural sector. Eventually, FDR, we'll talk about a little later, buys over 4 million acres of land in the Southern Plains through federal funds and begins to reorder the Southern Plains and plant traditional grasses to hold the topsoil down, and starts to improve conditions in the area. Okay, guys, so we know about Andrew Mellon, we know about Hoover's response. Finally, by the end of Hoover's administration, He has some of the lowest approval ratings in the history of American presidency. Americans blame Herbert Hoover for the Depression, even though it was really his predecessors who established the economic policies that destroyed the economy. So he attempts a few sort of flippant attempts to improve the economy, but it's really to improve his own standing in public opinion. You guys learned about these last week, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and also trying to balance the federal budget. Okay, let's start with the New Deal in chapter 21. All right, so the election of 1932 is really a referendum, or really a response to the economic policies in the Republican-dominated 1920s. Hoover is very unpopular by 32. Republicans know that they have a scant or scarce chance to win the election, and Democrats choose a man from a political legacy that still has enduring sort of presence in American politics, and that is the fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was born in New York. Like I said, he's part of this political legacy. Graduated from Harvard in 1904. He has tried to run several times. He ran in 1920 as a VP under Cox. He has been involved in politics in New York, and also sort of has national name recognition. He contracted polio in 1921, which rendered which made him lose the use of his legs. He tried to keep this private from the public. He would often, in any diplomatic meetings or things that were, published, meetings that were published to the American people, he would always be sitting down prior to the meeting, then everybody else would come in. He didn't want Americans to see him in his wheelchair. He didn't want to be perceived as weak. And he wins in a landslide over Hoover. So this, like I said, is really an indication that Americans are ready for change, right? And he directly addresses the American people at the Democratic Convention in 32, which is an important moment in this new definition of liberalism and this new definition of the government's responsibility to the American people. He famously says, "Men and women forgotten in the political philosophy of the government," specifically addressing Republicans of the 1920s, did not consider the working man, consider men and women. They were forgotten by the Republican philosophies of the 1920s. Political philosophy of the government of the last years looked to us for a more equitable opportunity to share in the distribution of national wealth. So he's specifically mentioning redistribution of wealth. Think about that. In many ways, that's a very socialist policy, right? This idea that the government is involved in taking the proceeds of America's economy and actively distributing wealth equitably among those who have created those profits. In many ways, that's a socialist idea. And remember, during the 1920s, socialism was a very taboo topic as we came out of World War I. So this really shows the shift in American public opinion, right? If you came out in 1924, the election of 24, and said, "I'm going to redistribute wealth in the United States," you would have no chance to win the presidency, because everybody supported this idea of laissez-faire economic growth and trickle-down economics and Andrew Mellon's economic policies. He also famously says, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." This is when he sort of trademarks his platform, which he will nickname the New Deal, which he really steals from Teddy Roosevelt from the Square Deal. Remember, we talked about the Pennsylvania coal miner strike and his idea of the Square Deal there in 1902, I believe, or 03. Okay. So he also wants to connect to the American people, unlike his predecessors. Hoover believed that the office of the presidency was untouchable and didn't really relate directly to the American people, right? He sort of distanced himself as this, unattainable entity that's running the country from the White House and isn't really affected by public opinion. Roosevelt believes very much the opposite. He wants to be directly contact or in direct contact and directly relating to the American people. So he does this through addressing them directly through what he calls fireside chats, where he comes onto the radio, which we know is very important in the 1920s for expanding capitalism and consumerism, this sort of advent of popular culture. More and more Americans own a radio, and this is how they get their information. So American families are sitting down after dinner and listening to the president directly address them on the radio. This is a major departure from 1920s Republicans who had really sort of distanced themselves from the American public. All right, so he takes office and he starts to implement what he calls the First New Deal. And it will be a comprehensive plan to tackle all of the problem areas in America's economy. And it'll go through two main phases, although there's sort of a third, a tertiary phase based on John Maynard Keynes, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so he gets into office in the first 100 days. He's in office, he nicknames the first 100 days and tries out as much legislation as possible to see what will create a positive effect on the economy. This first 100 days is the first congressional session of his administration. This is very much a stark contrast to this idea of individualism, right? He's saying the government is going to be actively involved in improving the economy. The government is going to regulate industry, provide direct assistance, and improve the economy through direct action, rather than this idea of individualism where it's up to the people to improve the economy, or trickle-down economics, which says we'll give tax breaks and allow these corporations to assume and accumulate enormous wealth, and eventually they'll pay their workers more and help the economy, which we know didn't work, right? So some important legislation during the first 100 days. The first thing he tackles is the banking industry. He knows that he has to improve banking, stabilize the banking industry in order to stabilize the economy. So the Emergency Banking Act is one of the first efforts of the first 100 days. So in March of 33, right after he takes office, he calls for a bank holiday, a national holiday where all banks will close, so that him and Congress can come up with a plan to save banks. They passed the Emergency Banking Act 3 days later on March 9th. This empowers the president to reopen certain banks that were solvent and assist struggling banks by providing them federal funds. Another huge departure from 1920s Republicans, right? This is a huge increase in the power of the president, a huge increase in the power of the executive branch, because he's directly involved in reopening solvent banks, directly involved in giving federal funds to banks that are struggling to survive. So again, this is an increase of power of the federal government, and the federal government becoming more involved in regulating industry to try to repair the economy. All right, so by 1932, over 5,600 banks have closed. This is a major crisis. Then he gets on to his fireside chat and he directly addresses American citizens and says, listen, you can trust the banking industry again. The Emergency Banking Act has been enacted and the federal government is backing these banks to make sure that your funds are protected. And it works. By April, the next month, a lot of confidence has returned to the banking industry, and over $1 billion has been reinvested into the banking system. This means banks can then lend that money out and make profits for themselves. By 34, only 61 banks had failed. So the Emergency Banking Act is a success. He continues his reform of the financial sector. The Glass-Steagall Act, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 creates the FDIC. This is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is really the government sort of putting their money where their mouth is. And they say, look, we're not just trying to promote that you have trust again in these banks, but we'll actually insure the deposits that you put into these banks so that you know that the bank won't close and steal your money. So under the FDIC, I believe originally it is $2,500. Yes, the federal government insures deposits up to $2,500. So you can put up to $2,500 in the bank and the government will ensure that the bank doesn't go solvent and steal your money. I believe now it's $250,000. If your bank isn't FDIC insured, go find another bank because this is important to make sure that these banks are federally regulated. It also restricts banks from recklessly investing depositors' money in the stock market. So again, banks in the 1920s are taking these deposits and investing them into a very unstable stock market. When it crashes in 29 and the banks lose all their money, it's not actually their money that they lose, it's their depositors' money. So because of the Glass-Steagall Act, which is unfortunately repealed in the 1990s, banks can no longer use your money as to speculate to buy stocks. Another step in improving or stabilizing the financial sector is taking the United States off of the gold standard. This again is FDR trying to get more power to regulate the economy. And if we're not on the gold standard, he can issue more paper currency to try to stimulate the economy. So remember the gold standard, we talked about this with William Jennings Bryan, this idea that that all US currency has to be backed by its value in gold in our gold reserves in Fort Knox. So if we get off of the gold standard, then we can issue money more freely, or the government can issue money more freely to try to stimulate the economy. So he wants to remove the US off the gold standard. All right. Another important aspect of the first 100 days is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. We know that he wants to stabilize the agricultural sector. This is one of the main causes of the Great Depression. And this will set production quotas for certain crops, okay? This is a very controversial concept, but basically in order to regulate prices for crops and for cattle and livestock and everything that ranchers and farmers produce, the government needs to become involved in how much of those products are being cultivated, are being produced. If everybody's growing corn, then corn floods the market and the price of corn plummets, and this agricultural depression continues. So the way that they do that is the government sets up a quota system and actually pays farmers subsidies not to grow certain crops. So they can control how much of that crop is on the market so that it's not flooded, driving the price down. This is a very controversial topic because it will leave millions of acres of farmland unattended and uncultivated to make sure they can regulate prices of certain crops. Also livestock. One of the most controversial aspects of this is the Great Pig Slaughter of 33, where the federal government literally slaughters 6 million pigs to regulate the price of pork. Well, at the same time, millions of Americans are lining up in bread lines trying to get free soup and free bread because they're going starving. The government behind the scenes is murdering pigs and destroying the meat so that they can regulate the price of pork to help pig farmers. Okay, eventually it does successfully stabilize prices, but it's struck down by the Supreme Court, which we'll talk about here in a bit, which is still sort of adhering to a lot of these Republican policies and believes that this is the federal government overreaching their power. that that it's unconstitutional for the federal government to set quotas, that it's unconstitutional for the federal government to manipulate market prices through subsidies and quotas. It's a case called the United States versus Butler, and it's a very important case in the Supreme Court challenging the authority of the federal government to regulate certain industries. Okay? So the Agricultural Adjustment Act is a success initially, but eventually is a failure because it's struck down as unconstitutional. All right. We also need to look at the Securities Act of 1933. This is another step in securing, or another step in securing the market, regulating the market to make sure that that banks and businesses aren't manipulating the market. Through this, we get the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which is still in practice today, which regulates commerce in stocks, bonds, and other securities. So basically, the FDIC and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC and the FDIC, contributed to this significant reform of our economy and how these banks function in the open market, how the stock market functions, and there's now more federal oversight to make sure that the American people aren't being manipulated. All right, we also see some direct relief programs during the first 100 days. FDR differs from Hoover in the fact that he believes the government should provide direct assistance to American citizens, although he doesn't really support the notion of welfare, right? Of just giving money to the American citizens. He really wants to create jobs over providing financial assistance. Eventually, we will see welfare programs and Social Security programs expand in the second New Deal. But during the first New Deal, he wants to provide jobs. So the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, is an important one in providing jobs. It provides jobs to mainly young men, unemployed young men, who simultaneously improve infrastructure in national parks and road systems and canals and dams and electricity from water generators and so forth. We have 3 million participants by 1942. And it simultaneously helps these national parks, wildlife preservation, all the things I talked about, while employing millions of Americans, giving them money to spend in the economy to help stimulate economic production. FDR, preferred creating jobs over providing welfare, although the Emergency Relief Administration, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, did distribute grants to local relief agencies who would help local communities. This becomes very controversial, as especially in the South and the West, these local relief agencies are discriminating against African Americans and Mexican Americans, and largely distributing or allocating federal funds to white Americans over minorities. We'll talk about the impact on minorities a little later. Oof, I gotta hurry. Okay. The Tennessee Valley Authority is also important. In May of 33, the TVA is established. The South is really hit hard by the Depression. The South has really failed to fully industrialize. Even by the 1930s, they're still very reliant on agriculture. They're still very reliant on sort of smaller local economies. So the TVA is basically a federal program that establishes dams throughout the Tennessee Valley, creates electricity from those dams, and brings these rural communities into the national economy. Once they get electricity, they can buy a radio, they start participating in consumerism, and they become part of the national economy. It also employs thousands and thousands of people to establish these dams. And it's actually one of the first instances of a federal corporation. The proceeds of this electric company, the TVA, which is established from these dams that are built by the government, profits go directly into the government, which then fund these social programs to promote the New Deal. The TVA still exists today. It's now a private corporation, and at a time it was the largest electricity distributor, or the largest electric company in the country. So this affects Deep South, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, the Carolinas, a little bit of Virginia, and it helps bring the South into a national economy. All right, so we see that some of these first New Deal programs are more successful than others. The first 100 days is sort of a trial period where FDR sees what will work. The first New Deal in general is really about recovery, right? Recovering the banks, recovering industry, recovering agriculture. This is about recovering the economy. So if you had to define the first New Deal, hint, hint, sounds like a good quiz question, with one word, it would be recovery, right? Whereas the second New Deal we'll see is really about economic security, okay? You guys also need to read about contentious labor relations during the first New Deal. 1934 is an incredibly contentious labor year with hundreds of strikes and walkouts being carried across thousands, actually, over 2,000 strikes in 1934 alone. This brings about the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which with the AFL, they combined in the 1940s, and the AFL-CIO becomes the largest union in America. This is also a departure from 1920s, when Republicans are trying to convince Americans that unions are bad for American commerce, American industry. Well, now the government is becoming directly involved in supporting unions. So make sure you guys read about the CIO. The Wagner Act is also important in that. The Wagner Act grants workers the legal right to form unions. And now unions are working with the federal government against these corporations. Okay, the second New Deal. Second New Deal really begins in 1935, and it's focused on economic security. This is largely possible because Democrats gain more power in Congress in 34. In the midterm elections of 34, remember, in the middle of every presidential administration, there is midterm elections which determine representatives in the House and the Senate. So Democrats get a lot more power in 34, allowing FDR to pursue more liberal economic agendas. Remember, he redefined the concept of liberalism to mean a government actively involved in promoting and regulating the economy for the benefit of the American people. All right, so some important second New Deal legislations. The Rural Electrification Agency is much like the TVA, trying to bring rural Americans in the Midwest into consumerism, brought power to rural areas, allowed them to buy appliances and participate in the economy. The WPA, this is the largest, the Works Progress Administration is the largest administration of the entire New Deal. They hire 3 million Americans every year from 1935 until 1943, where production really starts to shift to war production for World War II. So this is part of the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, the ERAA, and the WPA is the government agency under the ERAA, which provides jobs for Americans. The WPA does everything from construct national highways to building dams to building courthouses and public offices and government offices. It's not only construction, though. They are also involved in fine arts, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Music Project, and the Federal Arts Project. Also provide employment for thousands of artists and musicians and actors across the United States. Here in El Paso, downtown at the Federal Courthouse is a great example of this. The Pass of the North mural that's in our federal courthouse was painted in 38. And is an example of the federal government giving money to artists to try to stimulate the economy. It scaled back in the 1940s, but some of the accomplishments are, like I said, 3 million employed every year from 35 to 43. They lay over 500,000 miles of roads, construct 600 airports. Here in El Paso, Scenic Drive is a WPA project. Like I said, the Tom Lee mural in the federal courthouse, if you ever get a chance to look at it, it's a really beautiful mural. And like I said, it's the largest agency of the New Deal. Okay, the Social Security Act of 1935 is probably the best reflection of the goal of the Second New Deal, right? Provide economic security for Americans. The best way to secure Americans economically is to give them jobs. That's what the WPA is designed to do. Also, FDR wants to look at those who can't work and provide assistance to them so that they're not a dredge on the American economy. So the Social Security Act of 35 is an act to provide for the general welfare by establishing a system of federal old age benefits. That's a term from the actual act. So it'll provide pensions for old age persons, people who are too old to work. This is how we all pay into Social Security now, right? You pay part of your paycheck into Social Security, and hopefully by the time you're 65, you're able to reap the benefits of that, although we'll see for people our age and especially y'all's age. And it really illustrates this conviction that Roosevelt has that the government is responsible for the well-being of the American people. This is his new definition of liberalism. It's very difficult to pass. There's disagreements over how the program will be funded. Eventually, sort of a hybrid funding between state funding, federal funds, and direct employer contributions will lead to the Social Security, or passage of the Social Security Act. Okay, we've talked about liberalism in Roosevelt. Okay, then the election of 1936. All of this took place in Roosevelt's first administration. Roosevelt's only running for re-election for the first time in 36. And he's very popular. He wins by a landslide. He carries every state outside of Maine and Vermont. This is I think the second biggest landslide in American presidential history. And it gives him even more power. It emboldens him even more to pursue New Deal economic policies, to the point where he really starts to sort of toe the line of sort of usurping too much power to the executive. One really interesting example of this is the court packing plan of 36. So after he wins in 36, his only obstacle to passing all this New Deal legislation is the Supreme Court, which is still considerably conservative compared to the legislative branch, Congress, and the executive branch, FDR. So he proposes that everyone in Congress over the age of 70 should be forced to step down, and the president should be able to appoint the members to replace those that were over 70. Remember, this goes back to these checks and balances, that one of the president's authorities is to appoint members of the Supreme Court. Well, it turns out that the members of the Supreme Court that were over 70 were Republicans who opposed the New Deal. So this is really Roosevelt trying to get rid of opponents of the New Deal. Luckily, Americans realized that this was a usurpation of power. This was Roosevelt trying to gain too much power. And Congress shoots down the court packing plan. But what it does is it convinces a lot of these conservative Supreme Court justices that we need to get in line and start supporting the New Deal. So whereas during the first New Deal, they shot down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, they challenged several of these New Deal programs. Now during the second New Deal, a lot of them fall in line because they don't want to lose their power in the Supreme Court. So then 37 comes, and we go through another economic downturn. Agriculture really starts to suffer. We're spending so much money on the Works Progress Administration that inflation is beginning to take place. And the country is becoming weary of whether the government is spending too much money and has become too large to benefit the economy. This is around the same time that a British economist named John Maynard Keynes is coming up with new philosophies on how to address or how to view national economies. And he really focuses on shifting from microeconomics, looking at the conditions of specific industries or specific companies, to macroeconomics, looking at how an economy functions as a whole. And in this vein, he supports this or comes up with this concept of aggregate demand. This is an important concept, which is basically the total level of demand for all goods and services from a specific economy. All right, guys, I realize it's noon. If you guys have to take off, I understand, but I'm going to continue for another 10 minutes or so, okay? So aggregate demand is shifting the way we look at our economy from, we have to save banks, or we have to save the oil industry or agriculture or, specific businesses and industries, to an overarching view of the economy as a whole. And this will also really support the idea of, the idea of consumer spending, right? The power of the consumer in this economic process. You have to provide Americans with a standard of living, with a job, with enough money to participate in consumerism to uphold the economy. So Roosevelt's finally influenced by these, what is referred to as Keynesian economics, that we need to look at aggregate demand. And in this Keynesian economics, deficits don't matter, meaning that the government should continue to spend money regardless of how much money we're spending to stimulate the economy, to give purchasing power to American citizens so that they can stabilize the economy. So after 37, Roosevelt's weary and worried about spending too much money on WPA and agriculture and subsidies and so forth. But then he's influenced by John Maynard Keynes. And again in 38, he asked Congress for billions of dollars to pour into farm relief and unemployment relief and business relief. All right. So one more big New Deal agency that we need to talk about is the NIRA. I realized just now that I skipped the NIRA on accident. But the NIRA was part of the first New Deal. It's the National Industrial Recovery Act. And again, it's an extension of Roosevelt's authority. It creates the National Recovery Administration, which sets codes that businesses need to adhere to basically stay in business. This is another failure of the first New Deal, much like the AAA, because there are way too many codes to adhere to for these businesses to remain in practice. Also, the federal government needs to employ thousands of people to make sure businesses are adhering to these codes. So it's a very costly process that isn't producing a lot of results in terms of prosperity for these businesses specifically. A man named Hugh Johnson runs it. He's a very important head of this New Deal, first New Deal agenda. So I just wanted to touch on that because I forgot about it in the first New Deal, but make sure you guys understand the NIRA, which creates the NRA as the agency. Much like the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act creates the Work Progress Administration, you have a bill that creates a program, an agency, which carries out the components of that bill. Okay, so the first New Deal is very much about economic recovery. The second New Deal is very much about economic security, right? The first New Deal is about recovering the banks, recovering agriculture. It's a trial period for all of these new legislations. We have the first 100 days, the Emergency Banking Act, the NIRA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It's very much about recovering the economy. The second act is about providing jobs. I'm sorry, the second New Deal is about providing jobs, which gives economic security, providing security through the Social Security Administration, um, regulating the economy through welfare, providing direct relief to American citizens. And then the final phase, which is sort of part of the second New Deal, relies on Keynesian economics, aggregate demand, increased government spending, pouring billions of dollars into improving the economy, stabilizing the economy for economic security. Okay. I'm gonna let you guys read about the impact of the New Deal on racial minorities. Basically, racial minorities are largely excluded from a lot of the benefits of the of Social Security and of several several New Deal programs. The WPA, in many ways, is sort of a exclusionary program. Agricultural workers are not allowed to get the benefits of the Social Security Act, which is really sort of racially motivated, as agriculture is being dominated by Mexican and African Americans. So access to the benefits of the New Deal are largely prohibited or largely available more easily or more readily available to white Americans than racial minorities, unfortunately. And this really is basically because FDR is afraid of upsetting the Solid South, right? FDR is a Democrat. Democrats still have the majority of their base in the South, which unfortunately has some very staunch bigoted and racist tendencies. He's worried that upsetting the Solid South, upsetting his base of support in the South won't allow him to pursue the New Deal. So it's a bit of a controversial legacy for FDR. FDR was so focused on recovering the economy that he neglected a lot of social issues that were becoming very prominent in the South, especially with Jim Crow laws and continued disenfranchisement of African Americans. He fails to pass any anti-lynching legislation. And a lot of Black Americans in the South think that he really betrayed them as they start to support Democrats because of their economic needs. All right, so read about its impact on Mexican Americans and African Americans, and then the end of the New Deal. We start to see a shift in policies. We start to see the South challenge the New Deal. They think it disproportionately benefits the North. Again, the South is really slow to industrialize. Once he loses a lot of support in the South, it becomes more and more difficult to pass New Deal legislation. But really, the end of the New Deal comes with the German-Soviet Pact of 39, German rearmament in 35 and 37, which is changing power dynamics in Europe, leading to the rise of radical fascists in Germany, who start to challenge the geopolitical power dynamics in Western Europe. And attention is finally drawn to Europe after the German-Soviet Pact of 1939, and members of Congress start to look at this global conflict and stop focusing so much on economic policies of the New Deal. And also this fuels economic production as we start to support Great Britain and France through military production, which really stimulates the economy at the end of the 1930s. So it leads to this debate of what really ended the Depression. How successful were these New Deal programs? Or was war industries what really helped finally end the Depression? All right, guys, there's the Depression in a nutshell. Any questions for me? Any questions on the Depression or the New Deal, Hoover, Roosevelt economic policies, phase one, phase two, Keynesian economics?
Honestly, you did a great job, Professor. I feel like I get it.
Good. It was a lot to get through.
Test results, but
it was a lot to get through in an hour for sure. But hopefully, I covered everything. You guys want to take a couple minutes and go over your midterm review? You guys have any questions on any of the terms?
I do have a. I noticed that you put a lot of emphasis on the economics and politics throughout all this period. I didn't hear mentioning anything about the new feminist movement, which I think that influenced a lot the politics and the economics of the country during that era. Even though they did fuel a lot of labor issues, they did fuel a lot of economic issues and also political backing. During that period of time.
Definitely. I mean, so did, you know, subaltern racial demographics also had an impact on unions. A lot of these subaltern histories are very important to the process as well. But I wanted to focus on the government's response to the Depression because that's what you guys will be tested on. But you're certainly right. The new feminist movement, we really start to see the groundwork for the Chicano movement be laid during the 1930s, which really expands in the 1940s. We'll start to talk about the modern Chicano movement and how it's formed out of the GI Bill and really out of a response or a backlash against the obstacles that Mexican Americans faced in the New Deal. But you're right, there's some significant cultural histories going on and gender histories going on at this time that impacted society and the government as well. Any specific questions about terms on your midterm review, guys?
I guess what would you like to see when we're turning it in? Because you said you don't want to see descriptions, you want to see that we were studying it. Like, how much would you like to see for each term?
Right. Well, I don't want to see definitions. You know what I mean? I don't want you to just look up a term and give me a definition you found online. I want you to
Makes sense.
To treat it like your notes, right? You don't need to use complete sentences. Give me the term and then a few bullet points on each of the terms to just show me that you understand the terms and why they were important.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Wonderful.
Great. Since you guys showed up today.
I did have just one quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could go over the point that just says American pop culture. Are you talking about like the rise of like music and the arts, or?
Yeah, all of that. So we talked about the 1920s. We talked about in the 1920s, we really see the rise or the advent of American popular culture. We talked about the importance of baseball and the importance of the radio and promoting popular culture figures like Amos and Andy and Little Orphan Annie. The importance of cultural figures, popular culture figures, and consumerism, right? Babe Ruth selling Americans cigars, and Jack Dempsey, and these cultural figures are starting to be tied into American consumerism, the American economy. The advent of Nickelodeons and vaudeville and all of this sort of fashion becomes very prominent in the 1920s. These are all aspects of popular culture that really weren't that important prior to World War I, because we see, agents of consumerism like the radio is able to reach larger and larger demographics of Americans, creating this sort of popular culture where everybody's interested in these same cultural phenomenons: baseball, radio, music, vaudeville, dancing, etc.
Thank you.
Sure. So since you guys showed up today, I'll give you a tip on the essay for your exam. Your essay will be about the New Deal. Okay. So you'll notice there's not a lot of terms regarding the New Deal. That's because that will be covered in your essay. And remember, 60 points come from multiple choice and 40 points come from your essay.
Thank you so much. Would you say
Professor.
that would be over more the first New Deal or the second? Or
I want you to explain
combo
all
pack?
of it. All of it.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
important. It's important that you distinguish the two, you can say 2 or 3 phases of the New Deal. It's important that you cover the 5 major causes of the Depression that we covered. And make sure you sprinkle in some important agencies, WPA, NRA, some important acts, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Emergency Banking Act, Social Security Administration, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Well, good luck on your midterm. I'll post some instructions and a reminder about your midterm on Friday. And make sure you guys turn those midterm reviews in by Friday at 5 p.m.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Isaac.
Have a great day.
You too. Thanks, Alec.